Hello everyone, and welcome to the very last video in the Backyard Bugs series with STEAM Team Tuesdays. That's right, today is the very last day of celebrating all the pretty cool bugs that can be found in our very own backyards. My name is Kristen, and STEAM Team Tuesdays is all about exploring the world around us with awesome activities and exciting experiments, all from the comfort of our own homes. So I really think you're going to dig the activity that we have coming up today, and that is creating our very own wormery in a jar. It could also be called a worm farm, a worm observatory, a worm habitat. So this one that I have here, I just put this together yesterday. So the worms have not had too much time yet to do their thing and move around in there. And what I'm going to be showing you how to do is to layer different types of dirt in here, and then we'll add the worms, we'll add some organic materials or plant materials on top, then set the jar aside for a few days, up to a week, to see what happens. You can observe what the worms are doing and how they work in the layers below the surface of the soil that we might not usually get to see. But in a nice clear container like this mason jar, it's easier to see what the worms are up to. So a famous philosopher called Aristotle once said that worms are like the intestines of the earth. And really, he was completely right. Earthworms are classified as decomposers. They are organisms that help to decompose or break down, digest organic material. And organic material, or organic matter, is made from the remains of organisms, such as animals or plants, and their waste products in the environment. The process is called decomposition. Decomposition releases nutrients into the soil that were previously locked up inside those remains, those dead plants and animals. Once they're broken down, this allows living plants to then use those nutrients to help them to grow bigger and stronger. So it's a cycle. Worms help at the end of the life cycle, breaking up any of those remains or waste products that are left so that they can be turned into new healthy soil to grow more food, to feed animals, to feed us as humans, and the cycle goes on. So the most common decomposers are worms, of course, snails, insects like flies, millipedes, and sow bugs, as well as some kinds of bacteria and fungi. All decomposers help to recycle the soil and make it a healthier place for plants to grow. But in particular, let's talk about 5 things that earthworms do to contribute to soil health. Number 1, earthworms help to break up the layer of dense and dead materials, the organic matter that we talked about, on the surface of the ground. Number 2, earthworms help to turn the soil as they burrow down into the soil. And this allows more air or oxygen to enter into the soil. Number 3, earthworms help to allow water to flow down into the soil better so that the water can reach the roots of plants and give them a drink. Number 4, worms help to fertilize the soil with the castings that they leave behind after eating. Their waste products or the worm's poop, to put it plainly. Because of this, soil that has earthworms in it is much higher in nutrients like potassium, phosphate, and nitrogen, all of which can be found in store-bought fertilizers that help plants to grow. And number 5, worms help to eat pests that live in the soil. So things like parasites that might feed on the roots of grass, harmful bacteria, fungi, microbes of any kind, and they actually help to increase the amount of good microbes or good organisms that are in the soil, which also contribute to a healthier soil with more nutrients. Alright, so now that we've learned a little bit about the role of earthworms in the soil, let's get on with putting together our very own wormery. For this activity, you will need a mason jar or another glass container. The important thing is that it has a lid that can fit on it tightly and also a lid with holes in it. So have an adult help you to poke or drill 3 to 4 holes in the lid that you will be using. Next, you will need some sand. I gathered this sand from the beach, and you will need at least 1 to 2 different types of soil as well. You can dig up some dirt in your backyard. Be sure to ask an adult first where the best place to do this might be, or even use a potting soil. Optionally, you could also add in some gravel or small rocks. Then you will need a small amount of water, some leaves, grass, or plant clippings. Of course, you will also need some earthworms, for example, night crawlers or dew worms like these ones that I got here. You can definitely collect them yourself from outside if you'd like to. Worms are a lot easier to find just after it has rained, so if it's rained recently, go and take a look near the surface of the soil and perhaps you'll find some. Or you can even wet an area really well with the hose and the worms may come up to find that water. You can also just purchase some worms that are to be used for fishing, so that's what I decided to do. Finally, you will need a small shovel, scooper, or even a spoon. Now we are on to the steps. Step 1. Step 1 is to layer the dirt. Start off by creating some layers of dirt or sand in your jar or other container. I first added some pebbles in the bottom of my jar, and gravel works for this too, to create kind of a realistic bottom layer. Then I used my small shovel to add a layer of sand on top. As you can see here, this may get a little messy, so work on your wormery outside or on a surface you can easily clean or vacuum up later on. Next, I used a spoon to add some rich potting soil. So continue to add some clear layers of sand and soil or dirt until the jar is about 3/4 of the way full. I also added in a couple layers of the drier soil that I mentioned earlier in some parts to switch it up, and also in hopes of recycling it, as it was older soil that I had used for planting last year. In terms of dirt, feel free to use whatever you have on hand or whatever you have access to. I topped off my jar with some of the darker, richer soil to place the worms into. Step 2. For step 2, it's time to add the worms into their new temporary home, aka into the wormery. Before adding in the worms, or afterwards, as I forgot to add mine beforehand, you can pour a little bit of water into the soil to help keep it slightly damp. If you have had your worms kept in the fridge, like I have, you may want to take them out a little beforehand so they can begin to warm up before placing them in the soil. When the worms are quite cold, they can become dormant or sleepy, so they may not be moving around so much right out of the fridge. Next, take a moment to observe the worms. Gently touch one to see if it moves. Notice the way their muscles contract and expand for them to move. Hold a worm in your hand and watch how it crawls. What does it feel like? Okay, now that we've had our fun with the worms, carefully place a few into the jar right on top of the soil. I placed 3 in mine, but you could try adding more if you wish. Step 3. Add organic materials. Since worms are decomposers, we're going to give them some organic material to break down. Pretty much any kind of leaves, plant pieces, or grass clippings will work here. I decided to use some dried pieces of household plants, broken up into slightly smaller pieces, and then I arranged them over top of the worms and dirt. If all goes as planned, the worms should bring them deeper down into the soil with them and munch on them or eat them to break them down and eventually intermix them with the rest of the soil. This can take some time, so it will be interesting to see how much they are able to break down within the few days that I am leaving them in here. Step 4. The wormery is now ready to go. Screw the lid tightly on top of your jar or container, As mentioned, make sure that your lid has holes in it so the worms can get oxygen. And you may also want to snap a picture of your jar at this point to be able to compare how the layers of soil, sand, and organic materials look right now compared to how they will look in a few days. Step 5. Patience, patience. Now it's time to place your wormery somewhere cool and dark for the worms to get to work with soil mixing and decomposing. You could also wrap the jar in a piece of dark fabric or paper just to ensure that the worms have adequate darkness. You'll want to let the worms do their job for at least a few days, up to a week at most, but don't forget about your worm friends. Check up on them, see how they're doing, and perhaps how the soil has changed. Step 6. Now our patience has paid off and it's time for the final check-in with the worms. I waited 4 days to check in on my worms, and this is what it looked like. You can see that although not completely mixed through, some of the soil layers have begun to blend into one another, and quite a bit of the compost has been broken down as well compared to how it was before. Check on your worms and report to a friend or family member what you see. Did the worms do what you expected them to do? You can also take another picture of your wormery jar now and compare it to the first one you took a few days ago. You can leave your worms in the soil a little longer if it hasn't been a week yet, and if there is more to break down, because then perhaps you'll see even more change happening. Or you can choose to transfer them directly into your garden, somewhere with soil in your backyard, or perhaps in a park. Just make sure it's a place with lots of soil for them to burrow into and lots of food or organic matter to eat. For a remix on this activity, here are a couple of other things that you can do with your wormery. Number 1, and this one sounds a little strange, but you could try adding a metal object into your wormery, such as a coin or a key, just to see how much that the worms turn or churn up the soil over time. So start with just placing that metal object right on top, and then look each day, observe, and record what you see. How far has the object moved? For a second suggestion, you could try adding some finely chopped up vegetables or fruits to the jar so that the worms can compost them by digesting them. Try something like some chopped up carrots, celery, or lettuce. There's really many other things that you could try. Typically, worms don't like a lot of citrus fruits, onions, or any meat or dairy. So if you put those kind of things in, they will typically avoid it. Once again, leave your jar to sit for a few days to a week and see if the worms have munched down on and helped you break down and intermix your compost items into the rest of the soil. Now it's time for a real-world connection. If you have some extra worms from doing this activity and would like to take some more time to observe them and learn about them, here are a few interesting facts about earthworms. The reason that earthworms feel slimy is that they are covered in a coating of mucus, which helps them to move or glide more easily through the dirt. Earthworms can be found all around the world. The only places where they're really not found is in desert environments, where it's very, very dry, and also in places where the ground is completely frozen, such as Antarctica. Worms do not have ears or eyes, but they are still able to sense lightness and darkness and sound. They can sense light and dark through special receptor cells in their bodies, and they can sense sound through vibrations. Worms do not have bones, which explains why they are so wiggly and jiggly, but they are mostly composed of muscles, and the muscles are what allow them to move. They actually have two sets or two layers of muscle, outer circular muscles, as well as inner longitudinal muscles. Finally, and something that's important to know when we're transplanting our worms into a new location, is that worms can die out in the sun, which would be very sad, especially now that we know so much about how worms help the soil. Worms are very sensitive to ultraviolet or UV light, which comes from the sun. make sure when you place them outside that you're placing them somewhere where they can hide or burrow into the soil. This also explains why worms can tend to be more active at night or maybe on a rainy day when it is cooler and darker. So today we learned about decomposers and specifically the role of earthworms in keeping our soil healthy. Then we used real worms, dirt, and plant materials to create our very own wormeries, getting to see for ourselves this process that largely happens underground. Being that this is the last video in the Backyard Bug series, I hope that you've learned something valuable about how bees, butterflies, and worms contribute in their own ways to our ability to grow flowers, food crops, and more. All of these awesome bugs hard at work in our own backyards help us out in ways that we might not typically notice. If you haven't seen the other videos, for example on building a home for solitary bees, creating a butterfly feeder, or the last one about metamorphosis and the 4 stages of the butterfly life cycle, you can go and watch them right now on the library's Facebook or YouTube page under the S.T.E.A.M Team Tuesdays playlist. Thank you so much for tuning in. Keep exploring and experimenting, my friends. Bye, S.T.E.A.M Team!